Okay, everybody, welcome to week one of Next Generation Network Security, our sixth and final short course being presented first off in 2024. As always, I will give the system about 3 to 5 minutes to let everybody in. It's 7:29, it's just gone 7:30 in fact.
Good evening, everyone. I'm not sure if my audio is coming through.
It is indeed, Ian. Sorry, I've just
Okay.
got back online. My internet decided to
Right. Yep.
completely and utterly die, which is the second time this has happened when we're doing these short courses. So
Murphy's
yeah,
Law.
thank you very much. As a Murphy, I do understand that. I would, so just to start again, I don't know why it seems to take for everybody to get in, but I can see that we're all here. I was going to wait, but we've got nearly 400 people here already. So without further ado, I'll just do the usual blurb. So remember to set your chat to everyone so that you can actually interchange, I suppose, information and everything from people. Everybody else is already on there. I can see there's lots of people from all around the world. If you want to ask Ian a question, the best place to do that is through the Q&A. Don't raise hands and don't put them in the chat because we won't see them with so many people. They do flash past a little bit. Already there's 35 new messages since I started speaking. Whereas the Q&A, we actually go through and we audit every question and put them all to Ian during the thing. As you know, this is Next Generation Network Security, a free short course presented by IT Masters on behalf of Charles Sturt University or in partnership with Charles Sturt. And we hope that you get something out of this. This course, as Ian will no doubt explain, is allied with a couple of, well, it's allied with some of our subjects primarily, and it's also allied with a Palo Alto Networks certification, which Ian can explain more about during the course, but it'll give you some preparation for that certificate.
Absolutely.
Other than that, it is Cybersecurity Month, so it's a great time to be running this short course. But without further ado, I think I should just introduce Ian to you. For those of you who have been around for a while who may not have done one of the short courses, Ian has just started working with us as a mentor, but he is actually a 2-point-something times master's student at IT Masters. So from our end, he is a well-known old friend. And since he's been presenting some subjects for us, he's been doing a fantastic job. We get amazing feedback from his students. So I'm really looking forward to this short course, as I hope you are. And on that note, I'll welcome you in, Ian.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shane. I hope my audio is working well. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for your time and your effort. Appreciate you taking an hour out of your day. I'll start just by doing a quick introduction. My name's Ian Robertson, and That my spelling is a little odd. If you see my name spelt, it is I-A-I-N. That is actually the way it is spelled. Okay, so a little bit of a quick introduction on tonight's content. First of all, we're going to be talking about what is a next generation firewall and how it differs from more traditional firewalling. What's the difference between Web 2 and Web 3? What are firewalls able to, well, what can you do to defeat a firewall? How can you get around a firewall? We're going to talk a little bit about vulnerabilities and exploits and link that to advanced persistent threats. And we're going to sort of follow that up with both touch on perimeter-based network security and on zero trust, with both of which are related. Now, as Shane has said, please use the Q&A window for questions as we go. I will pause at various points throughout this discussion and give you a chance to have those questions aired, and I'll get through as many of those as I can within the time we have. So just a little bit about me. So my name's Ian Robertson. I've been around networks and network security for a quarter of a century now and counting. I actually work with some of the biggest organisations in Australia and New Zealand with relating to their network security and their network firewalling products in particular. And essentially a big part of my job is making sure they're getting the best out of what they've got. As Shane has said, I am a current mentor of several IT Masters subjects. And as he's also said, I've done a couple of IT Masters degrees as well. So a little bit of administrivia. So this course is first and foremost an introduction to network security. It is based on Palo Alto Networks certified cybersecurity entry-level technician, the PCCET courseware. It is, however, in 4 one-hour sessions, we can only sort of treat this to a high-level discussion. And obviously, therefore, there's a lot more study that you can and should do in order to both to do the PCCET and then to go on to do other Palo Alto certifications. It's also designed to be very broad spectrum. We're mostly focusing on physical firewalls here, but at the same time, we want to talk about network security holistically, because network security is nothing if it's not treated as an end-to-end discussion. What the course is not, because that's just as important here, it is not complete preparation for the PCCET or any other Palo Alto certification or any other vendor certification. And realistically, in order to be complete preparation, it would in itself be pretty much a whole university style course. It's not technical in depth. I assure you I could spend weeks talking about the ins and outs of configuring these devices. And we just don't obviously have the time for that. And it's certainly not a guarantee of passing any particular certification, but obviously my intention is to explain things as well as I can to try to give you the best possible chance of getting through and developing your career. With that, before I move on to talking about next-gen firewalls, has there been any questions come through? Q&A.
Nothing useful.
Nothing at this stage. Okay, no
Yes.
problem at all. Yeah, cool. All right, so we'll start with what is a firewall. So there's 2 separate discussions here. We want to talk about what a firewall is, and then we want to compare that to a next generation firewall. So a firewall, it's first and foremost, it's a network security device. Its job is to protect network links to allow traffic through while excluding other traffic. Now, they differ from older methods of protecting networks, predominantly what are called access control lists, by being stateful. That is, they can recognize 2 halves of a conversation and put them together. They work on layers 2 to 4 in networking terminology here. And basically that means they work with traffic from, we'll call it the Ethernet layer, from the data link layer up to the transport layer, which is your TCP or UDP traffic flows. Now, how does that compare to a next generation firewall? So there's still a network security device, no change so far. They're still stateful, again, so far, so good. Now, here's the difference. They will still work on layer 2, 3, and 4, so you can still treat them like a standard firewall. You can still look at, basic traffic flows and say, well, I don't want to see, port 23 telnet traffic on my network. So I'm going to restrict that. I'm going to drop traffic that matches that rule set. But they also give you the ability to look at traffic up to layer 7. So session, presentation, and application layers. Now, the application layer is one of the more important pieces in this puzzle because obviously, and we'll get into this in depth, this is one of the areas where modern internet infrastructure causes us many, many challenges when we're trying to secure things. We'll get into this in a lot of details, so just understand at the moment that the key difference between a next generation firewall and a traditional firewall is that a next generation firewall can see a lot more of the traffic and can understand a lot more of it at the application layer. In short, it can tell the difference between, say, Facebook and Microsoft Word. Okay, so next-gen firewalls, they'll provide application awareness. They understand the difference between, as I said, Facebook and Microsoft Word. They can also give you user awareness, so they can tell the difference between Steve in marketing and Anna in engineering, regardless of where those people actually might be physically on your network. And they can also give you content awareness, so they can see, for example, credit card numbers that should not be in traffic being transmitted or transferred. Now, traditional firewall, a firewall from a decade ago, for example, doesn't generally have this capability. Okay, let's get into application awareness. So basically, we're getting into a little bit around networking here. Networking, web traffic typically these days is carried over a TCP port 443, which is used for secure HTTP. So encrypted HTTP or encrypted web traffic. So being encrypted makes them very, very hard at a fundamental level to easily discern. There are various tricks you can use to differentiate them, but the reality is, if you're just blocking based on a port number, you're going to block a lot of traffic by taking that traditional approach. Next generation firewalls will use all of those tricks to say, well, these are actually going to different hosts. There's other identifiers in that traffic that can be used to determine that this is Facebook and we want to restrict access to Facebook during business hours. This is Microsoft 365 and we actually need that for work. And so it essentially gives you that ability to filter that. This is called application awareness. The other advantage of application awareness is that it gives you the ability to determine when somebody is using a network port in a way that was not originally intended by its maker. So for example, somebody might make Secure Shell, which is an encrypted console application. They might present that as HTTPS traffic by changing the port from port 22 to port 443. Now, if you do that, if somebody does that, a traditional firewall is not going to be able to tell the difference. But a next generation firewall will be able to tell the difference. It knows what the traffic actually should look like. And regardless of whether it's decrypting it or not, it'll say, well, that's not HTTPS. Yes, it's encrypted. It's probably SSH, and here's the logic that we use. And then there's very evasive applications. Certain applications like BitTorrent or Tor, the onion router, are designed to be evasive. That is, they're designed to be very hard for firewalls to detect. And a good application-aware firewall, a good next-generation firewall, will indeed be able to identify that traffic based on what it looks like, what its traffic pattern is. So the big takeaway here is that this is what when we talk about application awareness, this is what we're looking at. We want to know what is what traffic is traveling through, and we want to be able to block traffic when it's not being presented the way that we intend it to be. And of course, yes, we want to be able to use that info. It's all very well to know why we're doing this. We want to know this information so we can either permit it, we can deny it, we can prioritize it. So you might, for example, have a rule in place that says people are allowed to use Facebook at lunchtime, but you're not going to prioritize that network traffic over genuine business traffic, for example. So it's not just about allowing or denying, it's also about making business priority decisions. Then we get into user awareness. We've got Steve in marketing, we've got Anne in engineering. They've got different roles within the business. Steve's in marketing, he's got no reasonable need to know anything from an engineering point of view. Conversely, Anne shouldn't have access to Facebook during business hours. Now, the reverse might well be true. Steve might, for marketing reasons, have perfectly reasonable access to parts of Facebook, and of course is going to need access to engineering technical drawings if she's in engineering. Now, if they've both got laptops and they're both connected wirelessly, how can you tell them apart? Now, traditionally, in a traditional network, you'd do this with a desktop sitting in a physical part of the building, and you'd restrict access based on, network controls, typically network ports or similar. But if they're both sitting on wireless laptops, there's probably not a huge amount that differentiates those devices. If they're coming in over, say, the internet, that's an even bigger challenge. And yes, it is a challenge that next generation firewalls can address as well. Essentially, the simple way this is done is to automatically tie a user's IP address, their network address, and their username together, and then tie that to given policies. So essentially to be able to say, well, Steve's allowed Facebook, he's allowed it for these reasons. He might only be allowed parts of Facebook, and that's something we will discuss in later weeks. But he's allowed it. So his IP address will be given that access dynamically. And on the other hand, can only have engineering access and not Facebook. And that access control can also be done by linking IP address to that user and then having that automatically assigned to a policy based on a use case, on a need. Now we've got content. Certain types of content is generally best kept secret. Companies like to keep their proprietary information proprietary, and it's generally a big challenge to do, particularly with a traditional firewall, because a traditional firewall can't really tell what the traffic is that's heading out. If somebody wants to, say, send a customer database to themselves at home because they're planning to change employers and want to take it with them, a traditional firewall doesn't give you a lot of tools to manage that or stop that happening. Now, that said, too, there's a bit of a nuance here. We might not want to actually block it. We might want to potentially allow some data to leave. Let's say you've got to share a company database with a contractor, for example. You don't want to block traffic automatically in that case. You want to allow it out, but you absolutely still need to know that it's happened so that if it was done inadvertently or incorrectly, you can take appropriate business steps to deal with it. Now, this is a process that we call data loss prevention. And essentially, data loss prevention, as the name suggests, is about the business protecting and preventing the loss of its data. And generally speaking, that's done through a few different techniques, but generally it involves various forms of what we would call pattern matching. So knowing what particular data looks like, so what does a tax file number look like, or what does a social security number look like, what does a credit card number look like, what sort of files do we want to prevent Microsoft Word documents from leaving the organization? Do we want particular keywords to be flagged? All of these things are tools that next generation firewalls give you. Before we move on, let's
Might
just
be a
go
good time
through.
for some questions.
Yeah, I was just looking at the questions. There's a few of them there.
There are a few. Just quickly get this one out of the way. Do you have any recommended textbooks? Maybe you could put in the forum?
I'll put it in the forum after this. There are a couple of recommended textbooks. There's also some very good electronic assets for this course on the Palo Alto Networks website that I'll link to as well.
Fantastic. How does NGFW, which every time I look at that, I think not safe for work, differ from WAF?
Good question. So, next generation firewalls and web application firewalls, there are a few similarities. Both are application aware, both are more than capable of doing things like protecting content, restricting, say, credit card numbers from being entered or removed. The difference is in the focus that they have. So a traditional next-gen firewall is very much a generic type device designed to protect a range of different assets, including, well, web apps, web assets, web networks, and indeed, obviously, customer networks as well, or corporate networks. Whereas a web application firewall is very much designed around one use case, which is firewalling web applications. So the web application firewall is very, very specialized to that one function, and it's very, very good at it, no question at all. But it being very, very specialized at it means that if you were to try to use it to, protect your corporate network, you're not going to have a good day. It's not designed for that job. It's not going to understand what sort of traffic that it's dealing with. And it's generally going to, at best, become a traditional non-smart firewall when used in that use case.
Okay. Would a fake certificate be identified with a next generation firewall, even though the padlock shows the website to be secured?
Yes, absolutely. So we actually get into this because we do talk about decryption as a part of how you do a lot of this content inspection. But essentially, not only can a next generation firewall help you with identifying, non-standard or incomplete certificate chains, it can actually pass those warnings through to the users as well, or just simply block the traffic altogether. So there's a few different ways it can deal with that. But yes, certificate chain management is absolutely a part of the discussion.
Okay, in the content awareness section, I wanted to know if an NGFW could provide DLP feature by default.
Yes. In short, yes, DLP is a feature or is a capability that is available as part of content inspection and content awareness.
Okay, it seems that next generation firewalls have extensive access to business processes and data. Does that therefore greatly extend the surface area that could be attacked?
That is that is an absolutely excellent question, and absolutely yes. A firewall is a very valid attack surface, and absolutely could be and is attacked with that in mind. And obviously, if you have a major vulnerability within a firewall, you've essentially got very potentially the keys to the kingdom in terms of potentially being able to see traffic that you shouldn't or wouldn't otherwise be able to see, and very potentially that raises risks in and of itself. So with that in mind, and we do talk about firewall security itself as well, firewalls themselves need to be treated to at least the same level of security posture as any other asset or any other device, and arguably more so.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to say something more after that. Um, uh, Ledger is confused. Doesn't firewall mean just like Cloudflare or Akamai? But a next generation firewall also protects the files. Is this something deeper?
Sorry, I'm just trying to find that question just so I
It's
can.
right down the bottom, about third from the bottom. It's not super well phrased.
Yeah, I'll just. So Okay, I think I understand the question. So Cloudflare and Akamai are not in and of themselves firewalls. They both provide a form of network protection. They both do, for example, provide quite a bit of distributed denial of service attack prevention and DNS scrubbing or soaking capabilities for internet connected hosts, but they're not in themselves firewalls. They don't provide any real network security in that sense. They'll drop malicious traffic in bulk, and that's their job. That's what they do very well. They don't do much or indeed anything to differentiate between good traffic and bad traffic that would otherwise be allowed through a standard firewall.
Right. So then would you recommend having, actually, no, sorry, I'm going to miss that question. As you mentioned, the next generation firewall can give access based on user and IP address bundled together. But what happens when, most servers are using DHCP now? How do you manage that? Is it through like device address, MAC
Yeah,
address?
so we actually talk about how we do user ID mappings in a future session. But essentially, the typical way we do it is we actually have an agent that's typically installed on, say, an Active Directory server or in a DHCP server or similar. And when a user gets an IP address, we get that linkage through Active Directory. And then that's passed to the firewalls. The firewalls then know, when that IP address comes up, that user is the user that's associated.
Okay. Maybe we should probably go back those, as you can see, 20 odd questions still. Some of them are almost the same, but I think we can
Mm.
probably keep moving on and we can address more as we go.
Yep, sounds good. Sounds very good. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Web 2 versus Web 3. Now, I will sort of qualify this by saying these are very much marketing terms, but I use them because they're very well understood in the industry, and they actually do help explain a few good concepts here. So Web 2.0, it's been around a while. Was originally O'Reilly and Doherty that popularized it. There is a link at the bottom of the slides, and that link will be in the forums later as well. And essentially, though, they used it as a way to describe the internet as a platform circa 2010, 2011. Essentially, in that bucket, we're talking about all of the usual social media tools, Facebook, the platform formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, etc. We also include a lot of the as a service applications that you probably use every day in your workplace. So Salesforce, if you work in a sales oriented organization, Dropbox or Microsoft 365. Now, one of the big factors in Web 2.0 is it's all about the user as a contributor, or unkindly, the user as the product. If you think about Facebook, it's obviously a free service for us, but that kind of also gives you an indication of your role within the service, as it were. Your content, your contributions are essentially used to, drive engagement, and obviously that then, drives marketing and advertising dollars. And one of the things that Web 2.0 really brought into real focus was this idea of the perpetual beta. Things break. How many times does Facebook show you an error page? I know for me, I get one probably at least once a day, and that's seen by groups like Facebook as a feature, not as a bug. Essentially, they're always changing things, they're always tweaking, they're always making changes, and the service is always broken for somebody. There's always someone who's not seeing the content that they want to see, and again, that's philosophically, that's seen as a feature by them. Now, how does that differ from Web 3.0? So Web 3.0 is the semantic web. Now, this is a more nuanced, newer version of the web, the internet, if you will. And essentially, it comes down to a decentralization of technologies, of capabilities, and of data. So blockchain very much fits into this with a decentralized ledger type approach to data sharing and data management. Artificial intelligence and machine learning definitely fits into this category. And AI ML is absolutely a big part of what a modern next generation firewall does need to deal with. If you think about a typical business, a lot of businesses now have very strong AI policies because a lot of AI engines use the data that they're given to learn and inadvertently will end up sharing that, which basically becomes a form of data loss prevention management. And then there's mixed reality, be it augmented reality, virtual reality, extended reality. All of these things very much fit into the concept of Web 3.0. So edge computing, high compute at the edge, decentralization of capability. So basically the inverse of Web 2.0 from the point of view of centralization of content and of curation of that content versus decentralization and sort of edge management of that data. Now, why does this matter? We've been talking about firewalls. Why are we now talking about Web 2.0 versus Web 3.0? Well, pretty much any application you're likely to use these days fits into one of those two paradigms in some way. Now, if you talk about Web 2.0, these days with pretty much all traffic encrypted, there's no easy way to tell the difference between one application and another with a traditional firewall. As I alluded to earlier, you can't easily, with a traditional firewall, tell the difference between Facebook and Microsoft Office. Web 3.0, on the other hand, makes this problem worse in some ways because all of a sudden you don't have any central control. You've suddenly got a whole bunch of edge devices that are all talking to each other, Internet of Things devices that want to talk to each other or to the cloud. They all fit into that bucket as well. And so all of a sudden network security is a little bit harder because you don't have any central points of control. You don't have any clear visibility of who's talking to what and critically why. But that also makes it more important, especially if you think about IoT or Internet of Things type devices. If your home air conditioning system is talking to the internet, you want to make sure that it's actually talking to the internet services that it actually should be and isn't suddenly being turned up to 38 degrees on heat on the hottest day of the year. And then, of course, if you're in a corporate environment, how do you monitor your users and their behavior with these sorts of applications? So before we move on to the next section, any questions through here so far?
Oh, so many. We work on the multi-domain firework at our workplace. What would be the process to identify if the device is on behind a specific domain? This is not 100% clear. I've been pinging the device, and if I can't see any traffic, then I take it as it is not this particular domain. I feel that this might have been auto-translated.
Well, I've been. Okay, so Yusuka-san, you won't pinging the firewall itself will not tell you anything about the traffic behind it. You would generally with a multi-domain firewall be better off trying to connect to the service behind it using the service port or application ports that the service is using. If my answer just makes sense.
Hey, do you see the role of the firewall changing in the SaaS work from home era?
Absolutely, yes. And we do talk about that over the next 4 weeks.
Okay. Can next generation fireworks work for DDoS and protection and load balancing?
Yes to both, with qualifications that we will talk about as the weeks go by. Long and the short of it is that for distributed denial of service attacks, you still ultimately have challenges when it comes to network throughput. With regards to the second half of the question, which was, sorry, let me just pull that up. What was the second part of that question? Sorry, I missed it.
I have just pumped it into the thing. Do you just see it changing in the era? No, does it work for load balancing?
Yes. So yes, you can use a traditional fire or a next-gen firewall for load balancing, but it is not a good idea. They're not they're not optimized for it. But we can talk about when we will talk about various ways that you can make that work.
Okay, a couple of questions about next generation and WAF. Do you still need to use both, essentially, is the first question? Or
So in
should we
short,
recommend it?
yes, defense in depth is always a good approach. They do different things. They're specialized at different functions.
Okay, and a WAF apparently can be bypassed. Can a next generation firework be bypassed?
Generally, yes. So, and in fact, look at the slide that's on the screen. We will actually talk about various ways that firewalls get compromised, or the firewalls themselves don't get compromised, but they get defeated. The ways to get around them, as it were.
Okay. How do we make our home networks firewall to be not bypassable from a VPN?
That is an excellent question, and we will actually talk about that over the next few weeks.
Okay. Some firewall solutions decrypt secure communications and re-encrypt them after inspection. Is this still a
Correct.
valid security network model?
It is, yes. It is fraught with various both ethical and, in some jurisdictions, legal challenges. It's common in corporate environments that corporate environments will do this, but of course, depending on your jurisdiction, many corporate environments are allowed to do that by way of policy. In a traditional residential or home type environment, it is very rare because for one thing, you actually need to be able to control the certificate chain to do so. And that's typically only possible if you actually own and manage the entire infrastructure chain, including the laptop.
Okay. What advanced threat protection and prevention does the next generation firewall offer, such as intrusion prevention, malware protection, sandboxing? That's pretty much what we answered before, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, we'll be talking about that in depth over the next 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks.
Okay, just a couple more, then we'll move on. What's the difference with CASB, which are also identity aware, and they're very popular with consuming SaaS services? Is there an overlap?
There's a lot of an overlap, a lot of CASB solutions, including that made by Palo Alto Networks, by the way, actually rely on next generation firewalls for their the 4 parts of that solution.
We've actually got a few questions on hardware types and things that we'll do at the end, I think.
Yep.
How do you decide whether to classify data in data quality software versus NGFW?
Again, defense in depth comes to mind here. You wouldn't necessarily pick an either or to that to that particular challenge. Depending on your risk profile and your usage profile, you may well end up with both.
Okay. And we'll finish with this one for the moment. When URLs are blocked, it's possible to open with a VPN that is Siphon with a P at the beginning.
Yep.
Could we deny that?
Absolutely.
Great.
And
Next
we'll
question
talk
will be
about,
how.
yeah, and look, we'll talk about the how in future weeks. But essentially, in summary, applications like Siphon, while they are very evasive VPNs and they're designed to be by nature, a good next generation firewall can still reliably identify that traffic and therefore block it.
Okay. Actually, I will ask one more. We've never had any success using firewalls with voice over IP, on-premise or cloud. Has the next generation firewall addressed this issue?
That's an excellent question. The short answer is yes, because the usual challenge with things like voice over IP in a network environment is usually around network address translation, or NAT, and specifically something called an application application layer gateway, or ALG. And this has been a part of my life for the last 25 years. So long and the short of it is, a good next-gen firewall will absolutely address those issues well.
Great. Let's defeat them.
Let's defeat them. All right, so traditional firewall. I want to stop a user accessing anything that isn't a standard website. I want to just have a internet feed. I want them to be able to use, well, back in the day, it would have been Internet Explorer, and I don't want them to be able to do anything else. So traditionally, the way you do this is you block all traffic except that's destined to the internet on either ports 80 or ports 443. So port 80 is the traditional hypertext transfer protocol port from pre-encryption standardized days. Port 443 is the HTTPS or secure HTTP or HTTP with transport layer security ports. They both do the same thing. One's encrypted, one is not. And that'll stop any application that wants to talk on, say, port 5050. If you remember Yahoo Messenger as an example, or ICQ, which used a port in the 6000s, those ports, those applications just wouldn't work, except they actually would. And SharePoint's now broken. All of a sudden you've got a problem because a business application you could well be using no longer works. And that's because Microsoft have been clever with SharePoint, and SharePoint actually uses a range of different ports, both to help get out behind network address translation, which we'll talk about in future sessions, but also to improve performance. And that is certainly beyond the scope of this particular series. The other thing is that I picked on Yahoo Messenger for a reason. Yahoo would actually also happily talk to its hosts on port 80. It wasn't the default, but you could change it. And Yahoo Messenger had that configuration precisely because of corporate firewalls that blocked everything that wasn't on port 80 and 443. So all of a sudden we have a firewall that's not actually doing the job that it's supposed to, and it's just annoying people. And nothing is worse for security than security that gets in the way. Because security that gets in the way will be circumvented by users, and philosophically I can understand that, but it certainly doesn't help our case when we're trying to actually protect the business. Now, if we convert this now, we go to a next-gen firewall. We replace the previous firewall. Doesn't matter what brand it is. We'll just go with, say, Linux IP tables or BSD's packet firewall, PF, because they are a fairly traditional standard firewall. A next-gen firewall, you can define groups of applications. So you can have a group called business applications and put all of the applications that your business is actually going to allow in that group. And you might even include in that Facebook Messenger. You might, for example, be running a marketing organization and you need Facebook Messenger. Perfectly reasonable. Or you might answer business queries that come in via Facebook Messenger. And then, of course, you can basically have a blanket rule that still blocks everything else that's not in that list. And that might actually also include Facebook itself. So essentially, you can load Messenger, but you can't get, the main Facebook data feed. You can't log in on your home, on your standard home feed and all of that. But you can still use Messenger. You can still reply to customer queries and whatever else. So that's where a next-gen firewall comes in. Now, ways you can defeat those with various applications. Some applications, and this is an ongoing, I'm going to call it an arms race. Various particularly malicious applications or greyware, so applications that are a little on the less sanctionable side, will typically attempt to disguise themselves as something else. There's a few different ways they do that. If you're not decrypting traffic, for example, and we've discussed that it's a little way ago. If you're not decrypting traffic, you're going to have things like server name indication, SNI, which is a part of a HTTPS conversation that is not encrypted, and basically says what the server is that it's connecting to. Now, the server that it says it's connecting to might not actually be the server that it's actually connecting to. So there's other ways we can defeat the defeat, as it were. The next-gen firewall, I can also, as we said earlier, define some permitted users. We can talk about who has access to Facebook and when. We can talk about the accounting team having access to, say, MYOB, but nothing else, for argument's sake. And we can also define this based on time. So we can say, well, we actually do want to allow Facebook during lunchtime because, you know, people are allowed to have a break. Yeah, things like that. We can also define what sort of content comes in and out. We've touched on that already. Now, a question was asked earlier about threats. Now, that same ability to see content also allows us to see exploits and vulnerabilities. So we can do pattern matching or signature-based matching on signatures. We can use tools like Snort or signatures from tools like Snort to identify traffic that should not be allowed on our network. We can use it to identify particular vulnerabilities that are known in the wild. And with that, we can then also drop traffic that matches those vulnerabilities. So with that, before we move on, any questions?
There are heaps. A couple of people are saying that we were asking too many questions just at the moment. Mind you, some of them seem to be asking the questions. So we'll just answer just a couple. Can a next generation network detect bot traffic?
Generally, yes. Yes. And again, we talk about these, we talk about that sort of bot behavior, and that really comes under threats and vulnerabilities as well, actually. Threats don't just have to come from the outside, they can come from the inside as well.
They seem to have an extensive level of scrutiny. Can that lead to extended latency and degraded network performance? Do you have experience with that? What do you think?
That is an excellent question. Depending on how the firewalls are architected, absolutely they can. There's really two ways that traffic gets processed through modern next-gen firewalls. One is sequentially, where packet goes in, one rule gets checked, next rule gets checked, etc. That's slow because obviously it's done in series. Each rule's got to be tested, and then eventually it gets through. The other way, and this is the better way to do things, is to have a whole bunch of policies being tested in parallel. And basically, have the packet duplicated on input, put through a bunch of different engines in parallel, different pieces of silicon, because we are talking about hardware here. And those individual pieces of hardware all come to a verdict more or less simultaneously. And then if the answer is yes from all of them, then the answer is yes, as it were.
Excellent. I'm glad you mentioned hardware, because there's been a few questions about what the various merits of software versus hardware firewalls are, and if we're just talking about hardware here or virtual.
We're predominantly talking hardware, but we will also be covering the various software firewalls in future weeks.
Okay. Let's move on. We've got piles and piles of questions, but let's get closer to the end.
Yeah, perfect. So let's talk about what is a vulnerability for a start. So vulnerability is often, but not always, a software defect, so a bug. There isn't much software that's ever been created that is bug-free. It's practically impossible to achieve, and mathematically that assertion that I've just made stacks up. It's actually easy to prove that software is buggy, mathematically speaking. Now, that doesn't mean that every bug is known, and certainly that every bug is known by the people who need to know about it. The concept of a 0-day or a 0-day bug basically means a bug that's being exploited before the manufacturer that created the bug, or created the bug through creating the software, is aware of it. But once we know about them, we can generally, hopefully, patch them and eliminate them that way. So patching basically just means fixing the bug in this context. Now, vulnerability can be exploited. So what is an exploit? So it's an action or malware. So essentially, it's a double-barreled term in that sense. So an exploit can be something somebody does, or it can be something that a piece of software, malicious software, malware, does. takes advantage of vulnerabilities to do its thing, and it gives an attacker whatever it is they're after. Now, maybe it's just access to a system so they can launch further attacks elsewhere. Maybe it's access to your system so they can pull a bunch of data out of it. Maybe they don't want either. They just want to encrypt everything on your system and stop you having access to it unless you pay them lots of money. That is ransomware. Now, compare and contrast that to what I'm going to call advanced persistent threats. So an advanced persistent threat is something that is affected by people who really, really know what they're doing. And often these are people who actually work for a government. They're persistent. They've usually got a couple of, very key things that they're after. They might be after company secrets to provide to, people in their own jurisdiction. They might be, after a massive haul of credit card numbers if they're into organized crime, for example. And they're willing to take their time to get it. They're not a crash and burn type operation. They're looking to go low and slow. They don't want to be detected. They're going to find multiple ways to get in to keep access, and they're going to do whatever it takes to maintain that access once they have it. And well, threat means threat. It's deliberate, it's focused, and it's designed with those goals in mind. Now, these guys will typically utilize multiple vulnerabilities. Many governments keep libraries of vulnerabilities, including zero-day vulnerabilities that are not known to the manufacturer of the software to which they affect, and they'll use those libraries for their own purposes. And they'll also often use social engineering attacks to get in. So they'll send very carefully crafted emails to people like the CEO that look as legitimate as possible, as opposed to the traditional, scam or spam email, with the absolute intent of convincing that person to take a particular action, like run a file or what have you. Now, next-gen firewalls can prevent that sort of attack as well. They can be used to detect emails that should not be, for example, and drop them even after all other spam detection has failed in that regard. So any questions on that little bit before we move on?
Somebody keeps asking about the abilities related to phishing attempts.
So actually, that's a that's a good segue from what I've just covered. Essentially, from a phishing point of view, the place where next generation firewall really comes into its own is around content detection. So if content's coming in that is designed to look like an internal email but has clearly come from the outside, or has an attachment that is not what it seems to be, maybe it's got an executable rather than the PDF it claims to be, a next generation firewall can and will detect those and can basically prevent them from getting to the intended audience. So can drop them on the floor, can log a message to say that it was there, can do both, and so on.
If you're so minded, could you configure your firewall to route suspicious traffic to a honeypot rather than block it?
Yes. In short, yes. That's a whole topic of its own, but certainly we do talk about some of the threat management capabilities that firewalls give, and some of the modes in which you use them.
How do next generation firewalls, or are they able to detect and block social engineering attacks?
Essentially the same answer as for phishing or spear phishing. They won't block a social engineering attack that involves somebody walking up to the front door and opening it and pretending they're, Fred from IT. That obviously a physical social engineering attack is always going to, be as successful as the people inside let it be. But a social engineering attack that relies on phishing style techniques will absolutely be blocked by a well-crafted next-gen firewall rule set.
Okay, and last question is about SIEM or CM solutions.
Teams, yep.
Can the firewall act as a SIEM solution? Is it backwards compatible with older SIEM tools, for example?
SIEM and firewalls are actually very different technologies, but we actually do talk about SIEMs in week 4.
Great.
Awesome. Shuffle on.
Let's.
So, okay, now we talk about 2 different forms of security. We talk about the old and more the new, as it were. So the old way that a business would protect itself was with what we now term perimeter-based network security. So you typically have, if you're a large corporate, a massive firewall connected direct to the internet, and then 1 or more networks that sit behind that. You might have a demilitarized zone or a DMZ or a DMZ, and an office firewall, office network sitting behind that that has separate firewall rules. You might have firewalls on firewalls. You may well have more than 2 networks as well. And this was great. This worked really well when you knew where everyone was, when everyone was actually in the office working rather than working from home. This was great because it basically meant that if your assets stayed in the office, they were behind the firewall, and therefore they were, well, safe, weren't they? Well, they were and they weren't. It's great. It's like a front lock. If your front door is locked, it's great. The front door's locked, can't get in. What if someone goes through a window though? Or what if you left the garage door unlocked? What if you invited somebody into your house? No good having the front door locked in those sorts of cases. And from a network perspective, the same is true. It's all very well having a big, solid, strong firewall with multiple network segments behind it. But if somebody brings in a laptop from home that's got malware on it already, and we saw a lot of this back in the early to mid 2000s with various worms. Someone brings a laptop in and hey presto, it's now running wild on the wrong side of your firewall. And the other issue is, of course, many of us now work from home, in part or in full. And obviously since 2020, that's become far more of the norm. A firewall of that shape and size in an office environment does nothing to protect those people at home, or more importantly, from the business's perspective, to protect those business assets. So that's where we get into what we're going to call zero trust network access, ZTNA or ZTNA. Essentially, it works along the lines of what we're going to call the principle of least privilege. So that is, you give people exactly what, or give devices exactly what they need and not a thing more. In short, everyone, everywhere, everything is untrusted. You give people what they need to prove that they are who they say they are. In the case of a laptop, that might be with a fingerprint reader or repeated password entries. Obviously, there are, as ever with security, balances between security and utility that need to be considered. But the long and the short of it is that we basically treat everything as untrusted until they prove otherwise with authentication. And if you think about Web 2.0 versus Web 3.0, this is distributed security. This is putting security out on the edge where it belongs in a distributed world. Now, which is best? Now, a phrase you will hear me say a lot is it depends, because there is no one answer. And this is just as true here as in many other places with network security. So perimeter, obviously, there's a single point of management. It's a lot easier to manage one device than it is to manage several hundred, some of which are going to be physical, many of which are going to be virtual. But conversely, a single point of management also means a single point of failure. Perimeters don't protect against a threat that's already on the inside, whereas zero trust does. Perimeter firewalls tend to be big and beefy. They tend to be very, very expensive, particularly if you're a very, very large business, whereas zero trust networking typically relies on a lot of software and a lot of smaller appliances. So in a ZTNA environment, you might have a small appliance in your home that is used for parts of your network, but more commonly, you're going to have some software on your laptop that does the same job. Perimeter doesn't tell you much about what's going on inside the network, where ZTNA tells you a lot about what's going on both inside and outside your network. And remote access in a perimeter environment, quite hard to manage. Whereas with zero trust, everywhere is just as untrustworthy, whether they're inside or outside. So it doesn't matter whether you're sitting at home, on your lounge, or sitting in the office, you have the same access everywhere. And obviously users generally like that because it gives them a lot more flexibility in where and how they work. So which is best? Well, both actually. You don't generally pick one or the other with these sorts of things. And you'll hear me say defense in depth a lot. I mean, defense in depth in this context means you pick the stack of solutions to best match your risk profile. So if you've got a very high value environment, lots and lots of risk, you don't want to have bad things happen, really, really, really good idea to use multiple tools in combination. You might, however, have a lower risk environment. You probably wouldn't go down the path of using zero trust network access in a home environment. That would probably, for many of us, be excessive. But you probably do want and probably do have a firewall of some type in your home already. And that's essentially providing the same function as a perimeter firewall. As I said, though, Zero Trust typically does use perimeter firewalls as a part of the solution. So again, even within Zero Trust, we're not talking about an either or. This is a bit of a both discussion. Okay, any questions?
Okay, questions coming out of everything. Just so everybody's aware, we will close the questions off in about 10 or 15 minutes. We have more than enough already, but it'll give you a bit of a chance to add some more in. I've just gone through and tried to get rid of a couple. How do we differentiate, or can we differentiate spear phishing and whaling? How can the firewall help us avoiding both of these?
So we will actually be covering that in a later topic. So I'd actually prefer to hold that discussion because we could spend hours on that one alone.
Okay, where do you see NAC, Network Access Control, as fitting into ZTNA and perimeter security? And is NAC becoming a necessity because ZTNA essentially leads many to operate as if there is no perimeter?
After a manner of speaking, yes, NAC is a key part of ZTNA. It often goes by other names rather than network admission control on its own. But in short, yes, you want some form of trust that not only is the device and the user authenticated, but you want to know, for example, that they've got minimum standards of particular software installed. That you don't want somebody who's gone and disabled their antivirus software from having access, for example. So yes, there's a lot of overlap here, and there's entire tool sets dedicated to weaving those two together.
Hey, does ZTNA provide continuous security posture monitoring for devices connected to the network? For example, what if the system gets infected afterwards or the user is blocked due to any reason during the session?
So yes, a good ZTNA solution will provide what's called CSPM, and absolutely that's a key function of zero trust. Zero trust means zero trust. Doesn't mean that because you've authenticated once you're still there, that posture has to be maintained.
What's the difference between the next generation firewall and Zscaler?
That's a really good question. So Zscaler is far closer to a ZTNA style solution. The Zscaler solution is very much built around a software stack. They've only recently gotten into the hardware space at all, and is designed very much to provide that zero trust network access solution, in a very, very distributed manner.
Is there a preference for next generation firewalls? Do they work better with cloud or in-premise setups?
Both. Both is the good answer there. Obviously, hardware devices you'll generally find more often in a business premises or in a data center, whereas in a cloud environment or in a hosted environment, you're typically going to be dealing with a virtual firewall, but the functions they provide are the same.
Okay, how about AI and next generation firewalls? There's been a number of questions about that, strangely enough, including, how do you protect against LLM attacks or LLM generated attacks?
That's an excellent question. Essentially, and again, we'll be going into content detection in future as well. There's a lot of lot of questions that are basically, we're going to be answering them in time. But basically it comes down to the use of content detection and content management. So obviously from an application point of view, most of the LLMs can be detected as applications and restricted or permitted accordingly. But we can go further with a good next-gen firewall solution and sort of go to the point of saying, well, we might want particular parts of particular LLMs to be used, but we don't want to see particular data being sent to them, because again, not only does that data then leave the organization, so would trigger data loss prevention, but then often forms part of the compendium used by those LLMs for their own learning. And obviously that's, that in itself can create a fairly significant data breach for many organizations.
Great. Is a next generation firewall considered to be primary or secondary to server file system security, such as ACLs implemented on NTFS?
I'd go with both. I know that's a little bit of a cop-out in many ways, but again, you wouldn't use a next generation firewall on its own in that case, because a next generation firewall, while yes, you can use it with things like user ID to restrict access, you'd still want to use access control lists at a file system level to enforce that. Obviously, people can misconfigure firewalls just like they can misconfigure ACLs, and on disk ACLs, that is. And so if you've got them both set up, that protects against a mistake in either.
Okay. Is ZTNA the same as Edge, and is it mostly cloud used or used in cloud?
Is ZTNA the same as what, sorry?
Is ZTNA the same as Edge, and is it mostly used in cloud?
The ZTNA is mostly used in, well, these days, ZTNA is often used by corporates, by larger businesses particularly, in order to eliminate the need for an on-demand style virtual private network solution. That is to say, they're used to give people more transparent access to what they need, with at least as much security as a traditional VPN type, a business VPN might provide. Would you use it with cloud? Yes, absolutely. Would you use it with on-prem? Also, yes, absolutely.
Okay. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the complexity of configuration and management of a next generation firewall. Competence needs, training. What's your advice around that, apart from a
So,
tender's course?
apart from a tender's course, yes. So this course is a good entry to the discussion. Nothing beats hands-on time. So I'm always a fan of using things like the free cloud appliances, or the low-cost cloud appliances in various cloud environments, be it AWS or Azure, to experiment with this sort of thing. And hey, if it's part of your job, then I'd make the suggestion of getting your boss to pay for it in that case. Firewall config is complex. It's not something that you can sort of just pick up and run with. My general suggestion is start with a traditional firewall. Start with a Linux server running UPF or IP tables, and then maybe look at a BSD server running PF, for example. And then once you're used to using those and you're familiar with how firewall rules actually work, you can then expand on that with the application aware type firewalls, your next generation firewalls.
Great. Let's go back to Web 2 and Web 3. How do you differentiate between Web 2 and Web 3 traffic? And does that mean that network security in Web 3 is necessarily harder?
Web 3 is harder to deal with for the simple fact that it tends to be distributed. So this is where ZTNA really comes into its own. But ZTNA, you're not going to be running a zero trust network access agent on your Sensivo air conditioner controller, for example. So in that case, you're going to want fairly well nuanced firewall rules, probably on a very traditional style firewall, be it physical or virtual, running somewhere. And you're going to want to, think very carefully about what that device is talking to outside. So that's a Web3 use case. We're talking about a lot of distributed traffic. We're talking about devices that are talking to anything or could be talking to anything. And generally, we don't actually want them to be doing that. So, security in a Web3 sense can be a bit more of a challenge. The applications and the way they work can also be very, very different in a Web3 sense. So Web 2 generally denoted by really one port these days, port 443, and a whole bunch of IP addresses, various servers out on the internet. Whereas Web 3 is very much bi-directional, various hosts are trying to talk to you on the internet and vice versa. And obviously that poses both of those pose all sorts of security challenges, but in many ways the Web3 challenge is even harder to deal with.
Right. I've got a few questions around concealed traffic and how a next generation firewall can detect, say, VPN or malicious traffic that is bundled up in a VPN or an asset or a tunnel of some sort.
So there's a range of different techniques that are used to detect what I'm going to categorize as evasive traffic. So traffic that either masquerades as something else or uses other techniques to conceal its true purpose. And traditionally, BitTorrent was the canonical example of this. BitTorrent was very good at trying to hide what it was, apart from the fact that it was transferring massive amounts of data, that is. So the techniques that are used to detect it can also be fairly varied. There's techniques like looking at encrypted traffic that doesn't have, SNI or server name indication or other HTTPS type headers. If that's being sent out on a port that's normally associated with HTTPS, it's probably not HTTPS and should be probably treated accordingly. There's also various patterns that like data patterns that these protocols use, and those data patterns can be detected. Now, an analog to that is that back in the first Iraq war, back in the 90s, the Washington Post actually was able to use the patterns of deliveries of pizzas to the Pentagon to determine the exact time that the attack was launched in Iraq. So essentially a side channel. They obviously had no direct knowledge of what was going on, other than they knew that there were attacks going on in the Middle East. But when all of a sudden, middle of the night, everyone in the Pentagon's ordering pizzas, there's a fairly good indication that something was going funny. So those sorts of side channel methods, analogs to those sorts of side channel methods, are not uncommon when dealing with evasive traffic.
So I've got a follow-up question to that, in that would the vendors not sell little packages that say this is the, this bot detection package, or because here's the characteristics?
Yeah, I mean, various vendors have different approaches to dealing with how they sell these sorts of solutions. So Palo Alto, for example, since obviously this is a course that's built around Palo Alto, does have a range of different license packages for things like IoT functionality, for example, and various threat detection capabilities that have varying levels of sophistication, as it were. So it's not uncommon for various vendors to have, various solution stacks, and you basically as a customer pick and choose the ones that are actually important to you. So a customer that doesn't have, say, much in the way of Internet of Things devices might not buy the Internet of Things package.
Yeah. There are a pile of questions around different, what's the best model? Can you give us some examples of particular hardware? And there's a question around whether people will get access to maybe a Palo Alto lab as part of this.
So we haven't had the time to organise a lab for this particular course, unfortunately, and that's something that we'll certainly look at. I will provide some information in the forums over the next day or two on ways to gain access to evaluation instances that can be used in cloud, so in, say, Amazon Web Services. And obviously that's, if people want to tinker, that'll be the best way to do so. But this material has been built, and the questions for each week have been built around the knowledge that not everyone's going to have access to that sort of infrastructure.
Okay. Does a tool like Darktrace operate like an next generation firewall? Are there any similarities?
Yes and no. I'm actually going to bias that question more towards no. So Darktrace provides a very different set of functionality to that which a next generation firewall provides. So next generation firewalls are very much about providing that application and user and content aware network security first and foremost.
Okay. Actually, I know there was one right back at the beginning here. Excuse me. There's still, like, the more I ask, the more questions appear, which is great. So somebody was saying, does an next generation firewall always have to decrypt traffic to recognize an application? If not, how does it recognize the application or the user? I think we've spoken about the user, but what about apps?
Yeah, I saw the question before, and I actually intended to answer that because that is a brilliant question. So in short, no, you don't have to decrypt all traffic to be able to identify all traffic with a next-gen firewall. Obviously, the more you decrypt, the more you can see, and therefore the more you can manage. But like a next-gen firewall can tell the difference between, well, Facebook, for example, and Microsoft Office, or between Google Drive and Gmail without actually decrypting a single thing. And even in businesses that do allow and use decryption, and it is generally a business concept, the use of decryption, there will be certain traffic that they will not decrypt. They won't typically decrypt traffic that involves, say, your internet banking. There'll be certain other forms of internet traffic that we don't decrypt or that should not be decrypted, because doing so fundamentally breaks the conversation, because the security conversation is both between the client and the server, not just from the server. Now, in those cases, we can use basic things like the IP address of the host that we're connecting to. If we know that that IP address belongs to Microsoft, there's a pretty good chance that you're connecting to a Microsoft service. We can use a technique called server name indication, which is a way that encrypted traffic will disclose what the server name is that we're connecting to, although that can be defeated. And we can also use traffic patterns. So we can actually look at the traffic and go, well, that looks like a Google Drive upload, or that looks like an upload to an Amazon S3 bucket. And it's connecting to an Amazon S3 endpoint, so it's probably an upload to an Amazon S3 bucket. So we can, various manufacturers have various ways of doing it. Many manufacturers will use multiple ways to identify traffic, but the long and the short of it is you can get a lot out of it even without decryption.
Okay. I'm assuming this is a yes. Are traditional firewalls still in use? And if yes, why? And are there any downsides to using a next generation firewall?
So yes, traditional firewalls are absolutely still in use. The firewall that's built into Microsoft Windows is by any measure a traditional firewall. The firewall that Linux and FreeBSD ship with, the kernel level firewall, they're a firewall. They're a very traditional, not a next generation firewall at all, but they're still a firewall. They still restrict access to particular ports. Are there downsides to using a next gen firewall? Um, from a security perspective, not really, no. You'd still choose a next gen firewall over a traditional firewall given the choice. And in fact, there aren't too many vendors who sell a firewall that is just a firewall that doesn't have next generation capabilities these days. Pretty much every modern firewall has at least some of these capabilities. So any major vendor that you talk to today, if they sell you a piece of tin that they call a firewall, it'll do at least two of the three core functions that I've described as being part of a next generation firewall.
Okay. That's a repeat question, so we'll get rid of that one. Can we know more about Firewall SASE solutions as well?
Yeah, we will be talking about SASE in length in week 3 and 4.
Great. I'm doing real well with the acronyms today.
Oh, good.
A system that studies user and systems behavior, if that collects a whole pile of additional information, through decryption, isn't that a bit sensitive, is the question.
It is a bit sensitive, and it's why it's typically only done in a business or enterprise context where typically as an employee, you've agreed to a certain amount of monitoring of your internet usage. Internet service providers typically won't do this and indeed couldn't, because the instant they try, your web browser would tell you all about it, because the encryption chain would be broken. But yeah, it is. Look, as I said earlier, there is an ethical question to answer here, and there is some traffic that default um, rule sets will not decrypt, even if decryption is enabled. And internet banking is an excellent example of that.
Okay. Do today's next generation firewalls address the challenges with BYO devices culture on corporates when the ZTNA agent cannot be installed on personal devices or a VPN cannot be employed, etc.?
So we actually do cover that in a future week, but the short answer there is they can't. You can't solve business or policy problems with technology, and that applies here too. Yes, a firewall will protect your network and external networks, i.e., through two-way threat detection from an internal rogue device. So somebody's brought something in that's BYO. But fundamentally, that's still really a question for business policy and business management. And typically, you deal with that by quarantining that device onto a separate isolated network and probably putting it behind, yes, a perimeter firewall.
Somebody's asking if you've got a link to an open source data next generation firewall so somebody can do a bit of testing and playing with it. Is that an option that we can put in the forum?
I'll look into that, and I'll put something in the forum if I can find an appropriate asset. Open source is going to be a challenge, but there's probably low cost or no cost options that we can put forward.
Does NGFW have a nominally, actually, before I finish this question, we will be closing off the questions like right now.
Yep.
Does NGFWs have anomaly behavior detection or only signature detection?
Anomaly and signature are common feature sets in most modern firewalls.
Okay. Still got 16 questions, some of which are repeats from before. So we will continue for just a couple more minutes and then we will let everybody go home because it has been a relatively long session. How to assess the right firewall model? Is it based on number of users or bandwidth or throughput?
All of the above is the correct answer there. So particularly with hardware devices, sizing considerations will take all of those into account, because nothing is worse for user experience than something that's undersized and underperforming.
Somebody's asked for some real world examples of a next generation firewall. I think we've sort of
So
given some, haven't we?
yeah, we have, yeah. So, but I mean, there's devices like, say, the PA 440, the Palo Alto 440, which is a desktop firewall that you could potentially see in somebody's home. There's everything up to things like the PA 7050. There's equivalents from other vendors. Checkpoint have got their own. Essentially, to all intents and purposes, a modern enterprise grade, and I use that term somewhat advisedly, router, particularly an internet router, is often at some level a next gen firewall as well.
Great. For over flooding traffic, we use a firewall, but the firewall can be breached. So what's the protection measure?
I don't actually understand that question, because if the firewall is being saturated, the net result is typically a denial of service. So if by breach you mean that denial of service, well, that then becomes a discussion about what's called DDoS soaking using tools like Cloudflare. But I don't think that's probably the question that's being asked, in all honesty.
Okay, can the next generation firewall block traffic containing card data? I'm assuming they mean credit card data.
Yes, absolutely yes. Yes, it
Right.
can. And we talk about that as part of content filtering.
I'm assuming the answer to this is no, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Could a next generation firewall prevent problems like what we recently experienced with CrowdStrike?
No, it couldn't. In short, the CrowdStrike issue was caused by a bug. There's really no other way to put it than that.
We've lost your audio suddenly. Yeah, not completely lost it.
Okay,
That's better.
is it better? Yep.
Yep.
In short, the CrowdStrike issue was caused by a bug, a software bug, and a next-gen firewall would not prevent that sort of issue from occurring.
Okay, maybe 3 more questions, then we'll call it a night. Does it make sense to use both VPN and zero trust simultaneously?
Depending on the use case, it can do, but bear in mind that a zero trust network access solution typically involves some sort of VPN.
Okay, this might be a question to expand upon next week or the week after. Are there any incidents where the next generation firewalls failed to protect threats?
There are many. Like any security device, they're prone to misconfiguration. They're prone to false positives and false negatives. So false positives being detecting malicious traffic where there is none, false negatives being detecting good traffic where there is none. And look, I can't think of any specific concrete examples that I can actually give. I can think of plenty of concrete specific examples, but not ones that I can share. But the long and the short of it is absolutely yes. There's plenty of ways to misconfigure a firewall. Firewalls themselves are prone to vulnerabilities themselves, and those vulnerabilities can in themselves cause data breaches and data loss down the chain.
Great. Is SD-WAN part of ZTNA, or are they two separate things?
They're two separate but very closely related technologies, and we actually talk about both later.
Okay. The pizza example, is that an inference or a side channel attack?
That's a good question. So there's an argument to say that it's a bit of both. But long and the short of it is you can gain a lot of information about the behavior of an application from the behavior of the network around the application. So using BitTorrent as an example, you might not be able to directly see BitTorrent traffic depending on how how evasive BitTorrent has been configured to be, but you're going to notice a lot of traffic, and if it's all heading to a couple of known addresses, you can probably infer that those addresses are up to no good.
Second last question. Where do most of the ZTNA solutions pull their authorization from for access limitations? In a less sophisticated environment, what access controller would be appropriate?
So most customers would use something like Active Directory for authorization and authentication, but Radius can be used. There's a range. Basically, anything that provides some form of authentication will also generally provide some form of authorization, and therefore ZTNA can pull from it.
It's nice to hear Radius being used. One of my colleagues in a business I ran built their own little Radius server, and some number of billions of uses later, because it was used for an IoT applications, it's still going more than 10 years down the track.
A radiator, is it?
Yeah, it probably heats up the room.
Yeah.
We'll finish off with this one. I've had some little exposure to network flows about 12 years ago, so mostly forgotten it. But just curious, next generation firewalls run, I'm assuming he's meant to say stop flows because he's written ATOP flows, or are they both completely different?
So next gen firewalls, just like traditional firewalls, do use network flows to determine state. So to determine that this outbound traffic and this inbound traffic are related into a single flow of traffic. So in short, yes, if I've understood the question, yes, next gen firewalls work with traffic flows, network flows.
Great. Well, you've answered what is this? I reckon a record 86 questions tonight. Now, some of them I may have said they're answered, but you've answered them multiple times. So thank you for that. That's amazing. And thank you very much for this session. It's been fantastic. We've had a large number of people here tonight, over 550 at one point. And so in closing, I'd like to say thank you, everybody, for attending and sticking around for an hour and a half. It's been really good. Thank you, Lil, for looking after the chat, which has been going at a million miles an hour. And thank you mostly, Ian, for giving us such great content. It's been really interesting, particularly for somebody like me that has come into this many years after actually knowing anything about anything.
Not a problem at all. Happy to be here.
Okay, with
See
that,
you all next week.
We'll see you same bat time, same bat station next week, 7:30 Thursday in Sydney time. Good night,
Thank you
all.
very much. See ya.
Oh, great. You'll have to turn it off, Ian, as well, because I can't. I relinquished control when I dropped out before.
Right.